also the title card.
We out here.
And we are live. Here we go.
Good
Hello.
evening.
Welcome, everybody, to Max and Ben Save the World, a men's mental health podcast. My name is Ben, and this is Max.
Hi, I'm Max.
And we are therapists that do a podcast together. Some words up front that we like to share are that therapy is good, but this is not a replacement for therapy. While Max and I are licensed professionals within our state, this podcast should not be seen as a replacement for therapy. Also, go to therapy. It's incredibly beneficial. We highly recommend it. Our topic today that we are talking about is Epic the Musical.
You're hyped.
I am quite hyped about it. But before we get into that, what our topic is for the day, Max has a recognition.
Yeah, so our recognition for the day goes out to my friend Raul. Raul, we were out there helping out the Minnesota Marching Band with some mental health and leadership stuff recently, and just wanted to say thank you. You're doing awesome, and what a wonderful opportunity for us to come out. So if you're watching, thank you so much.
Yeah, we really appreciated it. It was a fun experience. It was
Absolutely.
really cool to be inside the dome with
The practice facility.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Our topic for today is Epic the Musical.
Yes.
By Jorge Rivera Herons.
Mm-hmm.
I first interacted with Epic the Musical like a month ago. I've only known about it for like a month, but from what I've gathered about it, it started in like 2017. Jorge Rivera Herons, I think, dropped out of school to finish it. But
I thought it was his project for his.
It was. He might have been his a project to finish school, something like that. But it has continued beyond school for him. It's kind of been this crowdsourced musical that has been coming out piecemeal and just completed in January, amid some announcements that it's gotten picked up by I think HBO for some level of production. So it is a speculative musical. It's one that doesn't actually have a stage production. It's one that's hoping to get one. Kind of a step forward or a new space in the internet for things like musicals, though. As Jorge released these pieces, he kind of let creative license go when it came to other collaborative work with art students and animators that wanted to get a piece of it and make their own fan projects that, as a result, now that the project is completed, at least musically, if one wanted to, they could watch a speculative animated movie on the internet, which that's what you did today.
That is what I did today.
Yeah,
Yes.
so Max is just interacted with Epic the Musical very recently. And so our perspectives on it are coming from somebody who's listened to it nonstop for a month and someone who just interacted with it today.
Yes, it's good to have a diverse couple of perspectives.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, to me, honestly, looking at Epic the Musical, I was most impressed by this guy's ability to market, the songs over TikTok. I really think it speaks to what is like a 21st century kind of marketing strategy.
Yeah.
For him building his own business. So to me, that is very impressive. And I think that it shows a lot of the engagement that gets happen on TikTok. And of course, I got to set my own feelings about TikTok aside. I'm not the biggest fan of TikTok, but this guy definitely made it big from doing things on TikTok.
Yeah. Well, that and from what I understand, a number of the vocal performers, especially in the later half of the musical, were people that collaborated by being found through YouTube.
Wow.
And that they had, only met on the internet, and vocal recordings, I mean, during the height of COVID and things, for several parts of the musical were done by complete strangers that became friends as a result, it would seem. I don't know.
That's really funny.
Parasocial relationships on the internet are something that we could talk about someday, but
Yes.
I don't want to assume that they are all friends, but they seem to present as such.
Yeah.
But Epic the Musical is a retelling of a very old story.
A story that a lot of us are familiar with, the Odyssey. And so, for those who don't know what the Odyssey is, Homer is a very famous ancient Greek poet who I believe was blind, according to some readings. It's a story about a man, Odysseus, who created the Trojan horse, if you've ever heard about that. and he is just trying to go home to Ithaca to see his wife and kid again, but finds that a bunch of shit happens.
Yeah, a lot of stuff gets in the way.
A lot of shit gets in the way, and there's a lot of songs in Epic the Musical about the things that get in the way. He faces sea monsters, gods, gets trapped on an island for 7 years, but also finds some help, and becomes a very different man along the way. It's really one of the very first epic hero's journeys, which seems to be a common theme this season, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
yeah, and speaking of that, we actually thought, because this is a third or fourth time that we've come to visit the idea of the hero's journey, we thought it might be a good idea to stop and talk about what that is. It's a structure within narratives. There's an entire field of academia around literary analysis of heroes' journeys across cultures and things like that. But generally, to break it down, the hero's journey is a series of events that we see over and over again throughout stories that are common across mankind. And the Odyssey, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, are some of the oldest stories that we still have and some of the earliest examples of the hero's journey. The hero's journey is not a concrete series of events, but a grouping or a cluster of them that tend to appear in narratives, typically in the following order. You begin with an adventurer who is called to an adventure. They receive some kind of supernatural aid that allows them to go outside of their village, which is the threshold, usually guarded by some kind of guardian. The beginning of an adventure outside of one's town becomes the beginning of the hero's journey proper, wherein they might meet helpers or mentors and friends, before ultimately reaching a climax in the abyss, or in Hades, the underworld, a deeply and profoundly different place from where the journey started, which, through the trial of entering into that deep, dark place, that chaos, that unknown, the hero is then transformed. And maybe through that process, they have to atone for some sort of shortcoming that they might have had or learn to overcome through that tribulation. And typically, that knowledge that is gained, that new item that is found deep in the depths of Hades, is then brought back to the village and used to enhance the lives of other people. That's, in a nutshell, the hero's journey, which is something that I think we can handedly say Odysseus hits many of those high points.
I think if someone thinks about the hero's journey, a lot of people will be like, "Oh yeah, the Odyssey." I think that's, a lot of scholars will be like, "Yeah, the Odyssey is the hero's journey." Like, a lot of people will really just think of it as the exemplar. The hero's journey, though, really isn't, exclusive to Greek myth, as we've already gone through Dune and Lord of the Rings this season. Those are also hero's journeys, but the hero's journey also appears across cultures. It appears in Star Wars. It's very much a common theme of, someone has to go on a journey to go, better themselves, do a lot of things, go through trials and tribulations, and comes back a little bit changed, but also perhaps bringing something good back with them too.
Yeah. So, what are some of those things that we hear in the hero's journey in
the Odyssey and Epic?
Yeah, in the Odyssey and in Epic, right? We've got the Abyss is obviously the trip to Hades to get out.
Yep.
Right? Aid from the goddess, I think, is something that we see as like I think Jorge Rivera Herons maybe took some modern liberties in the storytelling of the relationship with Athena and Odysseus, but certainly the core concept within that hero's journey archetype of the gifts from the goddess, or gifts from gods and goddesses, would be gods like Hermes and Athena within this story.
Yeah,
they give him the bag. They give him better ideas. Would be Athena's gift of a wiser mind, right?
I feel like if you look at it broadly, it's interesting because he's already kind of been on a whole adventure before the Odyssey, because Odysseus was in the Iliad, the kind of like the prequel to the Odyssey in terms of Greek mythology. but it wasn't like he wasn't like the main character, like the number one. I feel like, some others like Hector and Achilles come to mind when I think of people in the Iliad, but kind of has his own adventure here, and he does get supernatural aid from Hermes and Athena on his journey home. I do think like kind of the key like points of the Odyssey and the epic the musical that I feel like are important is the relationship with Poseidon. I feel like is really central. Poseidon is seen, especially to me in Epic the Musical, their interpretation as like a villain in this the undertaking, where he very early on, Odysseus, the main character, encounters a Cyclops, and the Cyclops eats a couple of his crew member, and he has to blind him and like trick him so that they can escape. And as a retribution, Poseidon curses Odysseus and his crew, and because of that, they encounter terrible storms at sea, and there's several exchanges with Poseidon that are very negative about hurting his kid, the Cyclops. And then at the very end, well, not at the very end, it's kind of like at one of the climaxes of Epic, they have a confrontation where, in this interpretation, Odysseus stabs Poseidon with his spear, which I was like, woo!
In a very Promethean kind of way. I think to me, one of the first thoughts I had was, this is an adjustment from the original story, and it seems like this adjustment is, as far as I understand the musical, or the music spoke to me, it seems as though Odysseus recognizes he can't kill a god, and so the implication is that he's going to torture him out of it, right? He's going to torture him until he concedes.
Whereas in the Odyssey, Poseidon sends a storm his way, and then he gets some aid from like another village, and they help him get there.
And he builds a shrine to Poseidon as an apology.
Yeah. So it's different interpretations. So I feel like, and then he becomes darker as a thing. I mean, just like the scene. I remember looking at the animation in Epic, and just like the scene of that, of him stabbing Poseidon repeatedly,
which I think was musically there was a lot of significance to the use of the themes and the little melody of Monster and the way that they sang it. And then when Poseidon is being stabbed, he cries out Monster in those same notes weekly. And I think then to follow that up with what is known as an Aristeia, it is in the original Homeric poems of the Odyssey and the Iliad include many Aristeias. They're moments when a warrior in the Greek mindset reaches his pinnacle, both physically and mentally. And Odysseus's Aristeia comes with the song Odysseus, when he completes the challenge of stringing the bow and then kills the suitors who had been plotting against his house.
Basically when Odysseus gets back to Ithaca, his home, he finds that his wife, having been there for 20 years, just by herself, has surprisingly remained single. Not necessarily single, but still remained faithful to Odysseus, not getting married again. But there's a whole bunch of guys who want to marry her, and so she had come up with elaborate things, like ridiculous challenges that no one else could possibly do but Odysseus, so that they couldn't marry her. And in the end, Odysseus kills them. Yeah. Which, I think it is kind of a wild thing. And I do think it brings us to kind of our point here of, when does a man become a monster as a central theme to Epic the Musical especially. It seems to be, I noticed in a number of the songs, and it's a little bit separate than from the Odyssey, but that you will have to do terrible things. You will not be the same man when you get to Ithaca. Were pieces of the musical that I didn't think were as central in the Odyssey itself.
You didn't feel.
I didn't think it was like as central. I think that it's in there, but I think that it wasn't like the central. I feel like it was more of a central plot point here. Sure. Where, I mean, even in the very last song,
the "Would You Fall in Love with Me?"
The "Would You Fall in Love with Me Again?" of like it's there, but I mean, obviously Odysseus changed in the Odyssey, but I feel like there's like this you have to do terrible things kind of thing that is going on in there, and I think that the scene with Poseidon was really like the liberty that Jorge, the writer of the musical, took. That was like, you have to do more horrible things in order to get back to where you need to go.
I think that's an interesting interpretation.
Yeah.
I feel as though there is some level though that I think that an emotionally interested or emotionally intelligent analysis of the text that we have would imply that this guy that's been leading around these soldiers who have miraculously lived, all 600 of his cohort live throughout the Trojan War, the 10 years of the Trojan War, and he has to kill an infant at the behest of a godly power, and then weighing upon him is suddenly, after 10 years of success, his soldiers are dying because of his mistakes. I do think that it's an interesting analysis, and I applaud Jorge for considering the way that and expressing the way that a man might struggle with that burden of leadership.
One other thing that I thought was different about Epic versus the Odyssey is, in the Odyssey, Scylla and Charybdis, the two sea monsters, they're next to each other. They're not separate songs, and he has to choose: destroy your entire ship by going into Charybdis, or go by Scylla and lose 6 men. And he chooses to go by Scylla and lose 6 men. In the musical, he goes by Scylla, the 6-headed dragon or whatever. And he has to go through there and doesn't devise a plan so that he has to sacrifice not sacrifice 6 men. Instead, he just sacrifices 6 men out of how many he had left. And then the people mutiny against him because they're like, "You didn't even try to save them."
Yeah.
Which I think was an interesting and different interpretation.
Yeah.
But definitely had kind of like a burnout piece of leadership in there, rather than sometimes you have to make compromises and 6 people will die in the original Odyssey.
Yeah. I think that brings me to, we should talk a little bit about how men can connect to this narrative. I think we've been talking about a lot of narratives and a lot of heroes' journeys, and an implication that we've made but not made explicit is that by analyzing some of these and by applying some analysis to it and talking about them, we are putting forth that a lot of men might see themselves in some of these characters. They might see role models or examples of ways of old knowledge. In particular, the fact that this story has survived since 800 BC speaks to some level of at least earnestness in its attempt to send some kind of message. And I think that some of the message that's inherently shared by a story like this is Odysseus shows us how to be a man. I think Telemachus is a narrative device to talk about societally and across generations how to be a man.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because this is a story not of a boy becoming a man, because I think that the hero's journey a lot of times has that aspect of there is a, I'm sorry, I'm going to go down to Legend of Zelda.
Yeah, okay.
I remember The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker is one of my favorite games of all time, and it starts with a boy on an island. He gets his hero's garb or whatever, and he goes out and becomes a man. And actually, in the advertising for that particular game, I remember that was a thing: a boy becomes a man. And Odysseus is already a man in the Odyssey. Totally already a man. Totally already went to war. Totally already has a wife and a kid. And
has been a king.
Has
already bested a boar. And in the original narrative, Helen of Troy, the reason that the Trojan War happens, right, is Helen of Troy goes off with Paris, the Prince of Troy. But when the kings of, I think it was Mycenae, was the area of Greece, couldn't decide on who gets to marry Helen, this stepdaughter of the former reigning king, Odysseus was the one that came up with the plan of drawing straws, which is the oldest example of the human use of drawing straws to decide a person.
I didn't know that was the oldest
in text.
Okay.
Which is crazy. And speaks to actually one of the first roles that I have written down here for Odysseus is a warrior of the mind. I think that Epic the Musical, I think one of my criticisms of it is I think that a little bit it's hard jumping in the middle of a story, to defend Jorge a bit. It's hard jumping in the middle of a story. But Athena and her relationship with Odysseus, I think, could be explored better, particularly earlier on. I think he makes some storytelling concessions by having like a flashback to their meeting right before they get to the island with the Cyclops.
Yeah.
But I feel like it is a little bit disjointed to have that, and then the Cyclops event, and then immediately, after being told that he might disappoint Athena, and he's been her warrior of the mind, her student for 10 years. We've got like 2 songs, and then suddenly they're not friends anymore, and we just have to we have to imagine that there was 5 songs worth of friendship with Athena that we didn't know about before we got to this point, which I think is a little rough, especially on like the first listen. But I think that his role I think the musical does some interesting things, particularly with the bass line that plays when he is laying plans in the very first song, as well as when they're rowing, as well as when they get to the underworld. Variations of the same bass song all play when he is describing, what's the plan of attack of getting inside the horse and taking the gates. And then that bass line actually plays slightly faster when we get our flashback with Athena and she's instructing him for the first time. And so there's like this musical theme that throughout the musical, of which there are many, but there's this one that seems to fit this. People are being instructed right now. If you hear that bass line, someone is being instructed. And I think that Jorge did a very good job of providing some subtleties like that. But regardless, the one that I really picked up on was that bass riff of, to me, it seems almost as if the music is telling us that the magical quality of being enwizened by Athena is in use. He's using that magical power because it goes away when they no longer are friends. That bass line does not play anymore until Telemachus encounters her.
Yeah, his relationship with Athena, I do think, is meaningful.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I agree on like they needed to go deeper into it, because I feel like from the beginning it was clear that Athena was like his homie.
Yeah, main homie.
Athena was the person.
Yeah.
Is kind of the supernatural aid, part of the hero's journey there. And there's definitely a couple helpers that he encounters on the way, but I do feel like Athena is clearly like, this is the supernatural aid that's going on. So he is, as of that, he is a warrior of the mind. And I also think if we look at it from kind of like the mythopoetic perspective, if he's already a man, there's kind of like there's like the warrior, there's the father, and then I can't remember what the third one is. There's like an elder or like a sage, sort of a thing. And so he's going from a man to becoming a sage. And so as he gets older, he becomes wiser and, strengthens his relationship with Athena as a god.
Which I do think is interesting. There's, to me at least, from as far as I understand the original, there's much less of this. Athena thinks that she's going to have this great warrior that will, almost like a messianic figure that's going to change the world. Yeah, Alisan al-Ghaib, that will change the world, that will lead armies in her name and make her famous and well known. And I do know that I do know that Alexander of Macedonia had some level of claim of being blessed by Athena and all
Alexander the Great?
Alexander the Great, yes.
I was going to say, I've never heard almost anyone say Alexander of Macedonia.
Yeah,
but it's true. That's where he's from.
Region, that's where he's from, yeah. Yeah, the one that conquered everything but didn't use elephants, that one. The other roles that Odysseus has are as a father and as a husband.
Yeah.
And I think they show up, those two go together quite a lot in the musical.
I think there's a difference between a warrior and a leader, too.
True.
Where he is a warrior of the mind where he's developing plans. And I mean, that's kind of in leadership, too. But I do feel like there's, I don't know.
Do you remember Action Man?
No.
It was on, like, Fox, like, Channel 9 on Saturday mornings in, like, 2005.
No idea what you're talking about.
Back in the day, when Hasbro was getting a lot of flack for G.I. Joe having too many guns, they came up with this new guy, Action Man, who didn't use guns. But the whole thing that this TV show would do, and it was like early age of CGI generated shows being done, was programming for boys, for young men, that demonstrated this guy that would often have enemies that would have gun-looking devices, but he would have this power to freeze time, and the CGI camera would pan and it would slow down and highlight, almost like Sherlock Holmes in the Sherlock Holmes movies, where he planned through the next thing he was gonna do.
But he can't do anything in slow time. He just is able to think super fast.
Exactly.
And slow time is an effect. Okay.
Yeah. I really got vibes of like that. I think particularly the ticking clock around the Athena appearances kind of I think evokes that. And the same thing with her interactions with Telemachus when he is fighting for the honor of his mother against the suitors. She slows time and teaches him how to fight instantaneously in the middle of a fight. And there's some clock ticking to the beat of that song that lets us know that we're thinking faster, we're thinking quick.
That he has divine aid.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah. But let's talk a bit about. It starts right away in the musical, though. Some of the opening lines from The Horse and the Infant, the first song. Odysseus talks about, what are your reasons for fighting? What are your reasons for living? And in a call and response with the Greek chorus that is his soldiers, he then says that his reason for living and fighting is Penelope and Telemachus, his wife and his son. And then in our next song, which kind of introduces the beginning of Odysseus's journey with When Does a Man Become a Monster, is the song where he has these second thoughts after being told by Zeus in the form of an eagle that he needs to throw this baby off of the wall. He asks himself, am I going to regret this for the rest of my life?
Yeah.
He ponders, when does a man become a monster? When does a comet become a meteor? When does a candle become a blaze? When does a ripple become a tidal wave? And
is that one of your favorite songs, Ben?
Oh yeah, I like that one a lot. But even in that song, before he contemplates that, the thing that I think what's interesting and is profound is that it begins with him looking at the baby and being reminded of his own son that he has not seen for, at this point, 10 years. And there we see Odysseus the father. We see Odysseus the father in a few places, but then it gets its own song. Telemachus is longing as a son without a father, and Odysseus's longing to be with his son are reunited in them being literally reunited in their song together. That I think shows us and is modeling of a father that is considering what his son's life has been like, as he has been fighting to get back to him for 20 years. In a way that I think music allows us to explore artistically that dichotomy between a father feeling as though he has been away too long and a son wondering, am I like you? Are two facets that are then put together through the art of music that then we're supposed to hold on to and to ask ourselves, what does that dichotomy mean for us as men and as boys? And for all of us, I mean, because we've all come from somewhere. We all either have a father or, like Telemachus, can relate to living in a place where we don't have a father in our lives.
Yeah, I think that the meaning here that I find is that Odysseus is kind of out there being, doing a lot of very manly things, very like leading a
you're
company,
killing monsters,
going to war, doing
yeah.
all of those things, and he's doing those things while also kind of being an absent father. And
yes.
I find that that's an interesting piece where he's doing these things that we would think of as extremely manly, but he's not necessarily doing like fathering kids. And I will say that it is kind of seen as motherly to raise children as opposed to fatherly as you just tell them the business and then you move on. And in Minnesota you go shovel the snow,
I think it's a more modern convention too. I think that Jorge kind of zeroes in on that a lot more than probably we don't know for sure, but 800 BC orators reciting this story might not have focused in as much on Odysseus feeling regret over the fact that he wasn't there to raise and to educate his own son. However, the original Odyssey does begin with Telemachus's recruitment by Athena, and the first couple of parts of the Odyssey are Telemachus learning about Odysseus's adventures by sailing around with the guidance of Athena and learning about him at ports that he had been at. And so the narrative framing of the story originally starts with Telemachus, which this one does not. Epic the Musical does not.
I was
It
gonna
kinda
say
does that a bit. It does that in the final act.
it does that in the final act. It kind of looks back at the beginning, and as I was watching the final act, I was like, I wonder if they could have done a little bit more of this at the beginning, and then just been like, hey, this is what's coming at the end, and we miss you, and that sort of a thing. But I admit it would be a little bit more confusing to have, like a little Game of Thrones, like we're in two different places at once, sort of a thing.
Well, I mean, Game of Thrones, like you said, I think Game of Thrones pulled off following Robb Stark and Ned Stark for a while, and then also some people might say that they didn't because of that final season.
I think that we could go.
We could go there.
I think the Game of Thrones is going downhill for a few seasons before the last season.
You heard it here, probably not first. So, other ways that men can connect to this narrative. We see the possibility for us, somebody that's a son in the shadow of their own father, or a son without a father that's on a long journey, whether that journey is something physical or something mental that they're struggling with, a man struggling with their own identity, a man wrestling with the burden of leadership, among a myriad of other things. I think that a lot of us can relate, and particularly in this interpretation of the Odyssey, to Eurylochus, one of the best friends, if not the best friend of Odysseus, himself betraying Odysseus, but also feeling betrayed. The "Luck Runs Out" song, he mentions, that we're all surviving by your wit, and it kind of expresses that Odysseus's crew seem to be questioning whether or not that blessed wit of Odysseus is still with him, and whether or not they should put the trust of their lives in it, which is interesting because just prior, we as the audience know Odysseus had revoked his relationship with Athena, the magical wit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that he clearly had a relationship with Athena for a while, and I don't know, from a very pagan perspective, she still feels like kind of his deity in a lot of ways.
Oh, for sure.
Just the whole time. I feel like that is.
I think that the voice actress, when she does the little part where she like checks in on him, and then he calls out because he's about to jump off the cliff, with Calypso. I think she really acted well in that, saying he needs me. I think was quite believable of this. He is favored of this goddess, and I think God Games is an incredible song, but is also narratively a place where we see that despite being renounced by him, Athena was willing to go to bat for him, which I think is interesting. We'll probably get into the gods a bit more later, but I think that we might be at a good spot for us to segue into our poorly explained philosophy segment.
And you've got something for us today, Ben?
Yes, I do have something for us today. I wanted to talk about the Japanese concept of Gaido, and I'm probably going to mispronounce things as we go. But the Japanese concept of Gaido, which is Geido, as spelled in English, is the concept of art as a procedure, the procedural nature of performance of art, and this concept and its core concept around Japanese aesthetics is the name of the study of this phenomenon within the culture, is that Gaido is this philosophy of mastery. It's a concept of applying the same level of care and dedication as one would apply to learning one's role in theater, and learning their blocking. You're walking out onto stage, you do it the exact same way every night. You're in a play, you do it the same way every night. You say your lines the same way, and as a part of traditional Japanese culture going back thousands of years, especially the arts like theater, pottery making, tea ceremonies, this prescriptive nature, the concept of Gaido, is this belief that by following the proper learning steps and by applying one's practice regularly and measuring one's own progress against their ability to perform the same task over and over again, one develops mastery. And this concept of Gaido, of art and repetition being and mastery of one's art through repetition being so interconnected to each other is actually linguistically the origin of why we call them the martial arts. The art part of martial arts comes from the Japanese and Chinese, which the Chinese call it Gaido, but they pronounce it slightly differently, is such an old concept and original concept within that part of the world that when the idea of naming and categorizing a fighting system came to English-speaking and Germanic and Francophone phonic parts of the world, we called it art because it was taught to us and spoken to us as if it was obvious that one would learn to punch and kick and perform not only hand-to-hand combat but warfare in a way that one has learned through the dedicated practice and repetition that one would also show in learning a Japanese traditional tea ceremony. And the idea of, say, in martial arts, in many different forms of martial arts, they might call them forms or katas, you do repetitive motions over and over again that are the same series. You know, might seem like a dance, but it is done often ascribed to being like the retelling of a particular battle. And by doing this, one thing that a student who is just starting out may not know is that doing that same kata or form or dance every day, or striking one's wooden hammer against their clay pottery pot in the same way every day over and over again, is the path to that mastery that develops by repeating something over and over again. And I think that one of the things that's really fun for us to explore is the different ways that people and cultures have come to the concept of mastering oneself and one's outside world. And so I highly recommend that anyone out there listening take a look at it. Look up Gaido, type it into your TikTok or your YouTube. There's all sorts of concepts and forms for it. It's really one of those things that in the last like 4 or 5 years has become kind of part of the corporate bro culture.
Oh my!
To like, what's your Gaido, and you know, talk about your routine for the day and as a ritual, but which I think some of us can a little bit roll our eyes at, but ultimately,
if it helps you,
yeah, anything that can help one achieve one's own mastery. And that's what I think the cool thing is that the lightning in the bottle of this concept is that once you learn how to become a master of one thing, and this is what the concept is attempting to prescribe, is that you could learn something that we might think of as a simple task, but is incredibly complex as we get more and more learned in it. If you told me to take some clay and turn it into a pot, I would at least form a bowl shape. But if I did that 50,000 times, it would look much better than the first time I tried. And once someone has learned to do that process one time, they can then extrapolate it to all sorts of other fields of their life. Mm-hmm. And so
I'm reminded of simply doing the reps at the gym.
Yeah, repetition at the gym.
Very much so. Yeah, I mean, I love the gym. Go more days than not when I'm not at my outdoor workout group F3. See you in the gloom. But it's really doing the reps. I mean, it's you're doing the work, you're putting the stuff in to get better at the thing that you want to get better at, and there's no replacement for that. I think that it's really easy in life to become impatient with change or wanting the really nice, flashy thing all the time. If we're talking about TikTok, I think about like the fabulous tricks that people do on TikTok, and it's like 10 seconds of your life, and you see someone do an insane flip. I don't even go on TikTok. Every once in a while, I encounter a YouTube short or like a Instagram reel because
you get them 2 weeks later
infesting somewhere else. Yeah. I hate TikTok. My old man yells at cloud.
Yeah.
But there was this guy who was like impossible trick shots of basketball, and all you see is him throwing a basketball, missing a hoop, but actually making a hoop somewhere else, and it looks completely ridiculous and insane. Mm-hmm. And you do know how many hours he practiced that and rehearsed that just to get that right, and how many takes that probably took. I mean, ultimately, again, doing the reps. Is he actually doing the reps? So yeah, I mean, this Gaido, sounds very much like you're putting the work in, you're gonna get the work out.
Yeah, I highly recommend anybody interested in philosophy, especially philosophy outside of what we experience in the westernized world. Check out Japanese aesthetics. as a whole, it's a really neat rabbit hole to go into, especially on the internet. You'll find all sorts of cool stuff. Like, one of the other things I've seen that gets popular, it seems, in waves is the Japanese aesthetic concept of repairing things by melting gold and putting the porcelain back together with gold. It always has little flare-ups of popularity I see online.
Yeah.
But speaking of the gym, let's get back to Epic, and our return to the topic is with Max. What do you think's going in the gym playlist? Anything going on the gym playlist for you?
I should be asking you because I don't know if anything's going on my gym playlist.
Oh, really? Not a thing.
It's a musical, and I've listened to it once, and I'm pretty picky about the gym playlist music that I listen to.
Okay.
There's some mixes that I really like, and I admit I love mythology, and so I'm kind of into it, but it's gonna have to take a few more times for me to be like, I really want this to go on my gym playlist.
Sure.
I will say, looking at the music, the first time that I listened to it, the songs that really stuck out to me, the one was Legendary in the middle.
Yeah.
Just kind of looking at,
Yeah.
just going over a lot of the whole journey. And then the encounter with Poseidon at the end really seemed
Get in the water.
That's
my favorite song.
Was quite like, whoa, this is clearly a climax to this story, even though after that he goes back and he kills all the suitors, which is a very intense moment.
Yeah, which it is in the original Odyssey. It's Odysseus's Aristeia,
Yes.
which, the book's named for him, and it's the height of his warrior's Aristeia. I think it's interesting that Jorge went with both a conventional, I would say like modern, right? I think modern audiences want that conflict with Poseidon, is at least what Jorge thought. Rather than an apology. Mm-hmm. And the Odyssey already had, the moment where he kills the suitors. I think they both work really well. I think it's cool.
Yeah, they certainly do. I would ask you, what's going in your gym playlist? You said Get in the Water is probably your favorite song?
Get in the Water is probably my favorite song. I think it could go in a gym playlist, but I do think The Horse and the Infant, it's opening with that kind of battle music that's
about the Iliad-ish.
It's the Battle of Troy,
Trojan horse,
Agamemnon will flag the guards,
yeah.
Menelaus will let her mates through the gate, and Teucer will shoot any ambush attack, and little Ajax will stay back. All of that.
It's a good opening scene for like a movie.
Yeah, it's got some let's get down to business from Mulan vibes to it that I think that like also belongs in a gym playlist, and was the onus of this question for sure was that one, and then like the full speed ahead when they're all rowing and they're up, they're off, and away they go, and all that before they get to the Cyclops and all the terrible things that are ahead of them, and they're quite full of hope, and just a bunch of guys done with a war and headed home. I think is quite a good uplifting song for when you're getting that last rep,
Yeah, I've got my hiking workout playlist with a lot of Ammon Amarth in there,
sure,
and Peyton Parrish, and it will hit the spot. So yeah, I will say there's not anything going in my gym playlist right now, but I will remain open.
Yeah,
I'll give it a second listen for sure.
Yeah, for sure. That's good to hear. What message does this story explore about defying fate?
I think that fate is really important to a lot of ancient religions. Definitely important in kind of the Norse area, and I know that in the Odyssey, the prophecy of don't kill the cows on the sun god's island, was kind of an early thing, and then
opening the bag.
Yeah, opening the bag.
Told not to open the bag, and he opens it in order to get away from Poseidon, not once but twice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you'll have to change in order to get home.
Yeah.
Was in the musical too, and so I feel like the thing is that a lot of those things actually came true, but at the same time, it's not like he really said you're not gonna get to Ithaca, you're not gonna see Penelope again. He was able to get there, and so I think that was good, but at the same time, the obstacles are there, and many times you do have to kind of defy your fate, and if yeah, I also think that they're, fate versus free will is one of those, discussions from like, ninth grade English that I remember about the Odyssey a little bit. And I remember raising my hand and saying, this is this is a funny memory, but I said, well, why isn't it just both? Like, I mean, we're making the choices, but like we're making the choices based on all the shit that we've like learned in our lives. So it's like determine what we're gonna make anyway. So it's like both. My English teacher was just like, no. That's not how that works. I was just like, oh, okay, I guess I can't be Switzerland here. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think, Ben?
I think to me it's interesting that there's a focus both in the Odyssey and in Epic on the roles of beings. I think to an original Greek listener, the story of Odysseus has elements of this immutable fact that the gods are the gods, men are men, and the monsters, the semi-divine beings that are in between them, are all on different levels of will and of one's ability to not only to be self-deterministic, but to be deterministic of their world around them. And I think that it's notable that one of the oldest stories that we have that survives is, despite this cultural knowledge that one cannot defy the will of the gods, one cannot change the will of the gods, Odysseus is this countercultural example of a great man whose wise mind and his determination allow him to overcome the
Those
will
obstacles.
of the gods. He's able to escape the inescapable island with a temptress. He's able to outsmart the woman that turns men into pigs. He's able to get away with blinding a foe without killing them, which I think there's an interesting. I think especially on the first few times, both interacting with the Odyssey and then coming back to it with Epic, I interacted with this story. It felt to me like this otherworldly like thing you got to be Greek to understand why Poseidon would want Odysseus to have just killed his son instead. But I think that to me,
It's a very different cultural context.
Go on. It's a very different cultural context. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, right. And I do think that to me, Epic kind of helped me to adjust this perspective and to consider that I think Epic views gods in this way of it acknowledges this place of them as being higher within the narrative, but is attempting to express their ability, which a Greek would also know that unlike I think a lot of Western post-Christianity religious doctrines would suggest, most Greeks would understand that the gods are individual beings with individual wants, feelings, and thoughts, and some of them are just and some of them aren't, and you're kind of just screwed by the fact that they're more powerful than you. And I think that the interesting thing about Poseidon to me is this ruthlessness is mercy upon ourselves concept, is the consideration that Poseidon kills Polyphemus, which in an original Greek listener would also hear in Polyphemus' name. Polyphemus is suggested to be a very young Cyclops. Relatively, he's like 250 years old at the time of the story in the original story. And Cyclopsi. What is the plural of Cyclops? Cyclops is?
Cyclops.
Cyclopeans?
I actually don't know. That's a good question.
Cyclopean people.
The Cyclopeans.
The Cyclopeans can live for thousands and thousands of years in a Greek's head.
I feel like it might be Cyclopses, but
yeah, it probably is. But the idea that this near or immortal being is blinded and won't be able to care for itself for the rest of its life is a reasonable thing that Poseidon for Poseidon to be upset about. Essentially, the solution to that is killing him.
Yeah.
And in the Odyssey, Poseidon has to put Polyphemus down, essentially, like a horse. And for a conscious sentient being that is essentially in its toddler stage, to be blinded like that and unable to care for itself in a way that its father god thing that has to be away at work controlling the sea all the time, can't care for it, is an interesting motivation for a villain to be upset with a Greek for not having the wherewithal to finish the job. I think it's such an interesting concept for us to wrestle with, of I think to me, as a modern, we're not killing Cyclopses, right? But we might be finding ourselves in positions of leadership or finding ourselves in places where not everybody is on board with the idea that you have or the route that the group is taking. And I think that a mythical or romanticized version of these events allow us to explore that concept a bit and think about for ourselves, how would we react to this force? It might not be a god, it might just be a person, at another company, or somebody that you interact with on a different team, or something like that you don't have the power to convince them of that you were trying to do the right thing. You just have to deal with the fact that sometimes there are consequences to our decisions. I think that Odysseus gives us an example of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that with the Cyclops, it's like I said, cultural context is really important. I think that back in the day, if you made, like, if kids with disabilities were seen very differently.
Oh, yes.
A lot of times,
absolutely.
If a kid was, born with some kind of deformity, they were, like, left out in the cold to, like, die or something. I mean, they're really, it was viewed differently. And so, basically, it was seen that Odysseus had made Poseidon's son disabled. Yeah. And that was so awful.
A heinous crime.
It would be, and I mean, I don't want to be like all, Valhalla and stuff, but if he died in battle, it would have been more honorable. Yeah. To me, it's very much about, like, the cultural context that you're kind of in. And I will say that, like, in today's world, like, people got a lot of different views. It's pretty, I mean, you're going to meet a lot of different people with a lot of different opinions, a lot of different things going on. And yeah, in the workplace, people may be very concerned with their honor or their reputation, and other people might not be. Other people are just like, let's practically get the job done. Why are you getting upset about this? So I think that it does require a lot of listening and good communication skills and open-mindedness. But yeah,
Speaking of that, listening, good communication skills, and open-mindedness, another central theme of Epic the Musical is greeting the world with open arms. And it goes back and forth a few times. I think it's often seen in the antithesis of ruthlessness being mercy upon ourselves. But Polites, who in the original Odyssey is described as Odysseus' best friend, is the one who presents this concept to him in a very catchy, much more upbeat and kind of beachy vibe than the rest of the musical really is, outside of the calypso parts. And we see musically and lyrically that Odysseus struggles with these words. It seems Polites is making a point, and maybe we should be open to the world. And then they're greeted with the Cyclops, and they have a horrible experience with that, and Polites dies. And that's another one of the things that's haunting.
That's quite a metaphor.
Yeah, what's that?
It's quite a metaphor.
That's quite a metaphor, right? Yeah, what does that say? Not only to us as readers, but to Odysseus within the narrative, right? And he struggles with that and goes back and forth. And you can hear some of Polites' theme in Get in the Water with Poseidon when Odysseus is saying, it's been 10 years that you've been following me around and making all of this terrible shit happen to me. Why don't we just forgive each other instead? And Poseidon says he can't. And his role within the narrative is to stick with the idea that ruthlessness is mercy upon ourselves. And I think it's very interesting that we're shown this heroic character like Odysseus is still holding some of that light that Polites handed to him early within the musical all the way up until the end. And I think that there's something incredibly profound about the fact that after that, and despite that, in the next act, it's not the next song.
He goes on a murderous rampage.
Well, no, particularly, yes, he does. But the suitors, during that murderous rampage, he kills the leader, and one of the suitors says, you've cut off the serpent's head, and it is on the lyrics, let us have open arms instead, that he says no. And he cuts off that suitor's head, and it goes back to screaming, and he has his little monologue about how they allowed hate into his heart, and now they all need to die. And I think that there's something interesting and profound about that nature of we as men. This is one of the oldest stories that we have of a man going and doing some heroic shit. He offered peace to the guy that taught him vengeance and wrathfulness, and then quite wisely, I would say. I think that's what the original orator would likely say. Chose the time to appropriately be a monster in his own house. To quote Jordan Peterson, he was being the monster, an absolute monster.
He was being a monster.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I agree with being on a murderous rampage of all the suitors of my wife.
Well, I think I'm gonna stop you there. I disagree wholeheartedly. It's established both in Epic the Musical and in the Odyssey that these men are going to murder his son and rape his wife. I don't think that Odysseus is questionable for the vast majority of history as being relatively justified in his actions.
I don't know. I feel like, to me, it's more of a treatise on I have been wronged, and so now I will wrong you. At the same time, yes, it is serious. Of they're gonna rape his wife and kill his kid, and that is very serious. I do think that is very serious. I do think that I don't know. In the animation, he had the red eyes while he was kind of doing the murders.
He was being the monster.
He was being the monster, very much so. And I think that it is poetic for sure that he's engaging in that. But to me, it's not an exciting like, yes, you've become a man and you've done the thing that was necessary.
Oh, I disagree.
To me, it was you are perpetuating a culture of violence that is going to destroy you and society.
Oh yeah, I think that Athena's themes really demonstrate that. I think that's what Athena's getting at, right? When she says, if you had seen it my way, if only you had seen what we could become. And he says something like, that world sounds really nice, but it's not one I know. For now, I need to get back to my wife. I think that, as you mentioned before, the uniqueness of this heroic journey is really showing us this is not an example of a young man that's 15, 16 years old going out of the village and becoming a young man. It is an adult man who becomes an older and wizened man. And I think that, to me, what I really hear in the message is that, as I'm joking when I sarcastically quote Jordan B. Peterson, but he had a point too in some of his lectures on the fact that I personally am of the stance that I think a man should be prepared to be a monster when it is required of him. I think that the world is too chaotic a place for us to say that the only venerable trait is somebody who has committed themselves to nonviolence to a point that they never consider it. I think it's far more venerable to be a man that understands the extreme weight of violence and for what it is, and I think Odysseus certainly shows that he did not at the beginning of his narrative, but by the end, I think that what he's showing us is that sometimes a man must make incredibly difficult decisions and do what he must to secure his house and home.
Yeah. I know that some of that predates Jordan B. Peterson.
Oh, yeah. That's the concept Jordan Peterson is highlighting from narratives like
and there
this.
are ways in which he's gone off the deep end, despite some of his other pieces. But one of my very favorite books, Iron John, by Robert Bly, does posit that there are absolutely things that men must do that may seem wild, especially to women, that not everyone is going to understand what to do, and that is necessarily a part of being a man, and it is inescapable. That to be wild and to do that is necessary, and a lot of times you'll feel emasculated if you don't have those pieces of you.
Yeah.
So I hear that, but at the same time, I think that there is, maybe I'm looking at it from a more modern interpretation of, it's kind of toxic that he just goes up and murders everyone. I'm just kind of like that's a lot of killing. I mean, if you're really the king, send them into exile, something like that. Figure out something else. If you're really friends with Athena, figure out some kind of divine punishment. But yeah, I
think that's a good creative idea. Yeah. I don't know. I think there's something to the. I just disagree. As a husband,
I think that it's poetic.
Quite agree.
And I also think that I mean, obviously, what the suitors were going to do is really bad. It's super, super bad. I mean, I also think that just like, I will say that it's poetic, but I don't think that killing people is the right thing that way.
Oh, absolutely. I think that only supposing that we're in a narrative already where it's been established that I guess our good guy is cool with killing people. Everybody's killing people because it's ancient Greece.
Yeah.
I'm willing to engage with the medium and see that I'm fairly certain that one of the reasons that this story survived was that there is something to that message of the nobleness that there is. I think we see it throughout the story that a person like Odysseus struggles so much with, I think, the question of violence itself, of what is the nature of violence. I think if we really break down the themes of being a monster or ruthlessness, being mercy upon ourselves, is this question of, is violence necessary? Must I commit violence? Is violence something that I should respond to when it's thrust upon me? And he goes through all of these different modes of weighing this and going back and forth, and then he clearly doesn't go to whatever the streaming website is and buys followers. He applies the knowledge that he's gained and demonstrates the mastery of someone who has really struggled with that. And I think that there's something in his role as a king that the Greeks are immortalizing and remembering, a good king as someone who has lived a good life, someone who has lived a, maybe not good life, a life with experiences, and so that they know that their experiences allow them to make better decisions.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that if you're looking at the original Odyssey and the Scylla versus Charybdis decision of like, do you want the whole ship to sink or do you want 6 people to die? Mm-hmm. You know, I think that represents some of the difficult decisions that he has to make, and I do think that you know, killing the suitors does make you look at, you know, the darkness that exists within all human hearts. Is definitely there. Yeah. I know that, you know, I'm not a husband. I spent a lot of my adult life as a single person. I think, you know, if we're talking about like Penelope in particular, I will say that, you know, perhaps like the story is not quite as impactful in that way to me because I have spent most of my adult life as a single man. Yeah. And that, you know, like, yes, sure, he should get back to Penelope. It's what he wants. It makes sense. It's his role. But it's not as relatable to me.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. That I hadn't thought about that when we were talking about ways that it's different from the hero's journey. Most, if not, I'm struggling to think of another hero besides Anakin Skywalker that gets married or is married. Quite often, you don't have somebody leaving the village, going through this transformative process, and then coming back.
The love interest feels.
Perseus comes back to the village with the girl, with Andromeda, in Greek mythology, right? Hercules with Megara, right? Well, and then more things happen. But there's so many examples of a hero being a young man that doesn't have a wife. I will say my perspective as a husband and somebody that's been married for 7 years now. I really hear and see there's something to the artistic quality that has survived so many generations in what's being said about husbandry in this narrative, for sure.
I think there's a lot to be said about fidelity,
yes,
especially from the modern perspective. I will say it's definitely like a super like monogamy perspective, at least in the way of Epic the musical. I did see an interesting thing recently that you know, someone's gonna fight everyone about Zeus and Hercules, the Disney adaptation, is like the most faithful adaptation of Zeus Fight Me. And someone had said, well, you know, he's an honorable man who does a lot of different things and is faithful to his wife. And back then in ancient Greece, it actually wasn't as big of a deal to be unfaithful to your wife because the woman might care, but who cares what a woman thinks?
Yeah,
it's actually what people would think in ancient Greece.
Yeah.
So, you know, I was kind of like, that's an interesting take on things. But yeah, so I mean, if you look at the Odyssey, Odysseus sleeps with Circe, the witch, for like a year, and just is there. And I'm like, wow, dude, like, you know, that's removed from Epic the musical because in our cultural context, it doesn't necessarily make sense. And I think that like the murdering all the suitors doesn't necessarily make sense. But I do think that Jorge did take some liberties in that it makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah,
in the story.
I think he made it nice for modern audiences to relate to.
For sure.
Which I think enhances some of that. I think that, to me, a lot of the ways that he shaved away the original seem to me to be in an effort to enhance the central themes that we as modern audiences can draw from it.
Yeah.
And I think that is a noble artistic endeavor for him to have done.
Yeah.
Speaking of noble efforts, though, it comes to my attention that we're nearing the end of our show, and you might have somebody that also had some noble efforts that you want to share with us today.
Yes. So we've got To Who Saved the World, and I just wanted to share one of probably one of the more famous philosophers that people know of is Marcus Aurelius, a very famous Roman emperor who was also a Stoic philosopher. I think that he has a lot of great ideas and also oversaw a large portion of the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace, really, kind of like the peak of ancient Rome. So we're kind of the classics today. So Marcus Aurelius once said, if anyone can refute me, show me I'm making a mistake or looking at things from the wrong perspective. I'll gladly change. It's the truth I'm after, and the truth never harmed anyone. And I do think that having dialogues about, like, how Ben and I disagreed about, what's going on with the Suter murder.
Sure,
is
yeah.
that something that was just? Is that something that was not just? And I feel like, we're both honestly in the same place that we were, like, when we started the podcast about our opinions on that.
Sure.
I'm still kind of like, that's not great. And you're kind of like, yeah, I see where that's coming from.
Yeah.
And, people have different ideas, and you got to be able to disagree with them and talk about it and figure it out. So thanks, Marcus Aurelius, for some good ideas like that.
Yeah, I think I really hear in that too. It calls to mind, I think recently I've seen a number of things on kind of like the neurodivergent side of social media.
Yeah.
Talking about interactions between neurodivergent people, say somebody that is either on the autism spectrum or has ADHD or something similar, in behaviors in arguments. Someone who is more neurodivergent is more likely to seek context when arguing with another person, and so they'll try to find out as much information as they can about extrapolating factors, and often they can try and do so in a way that is useful for them to solve what happens so that they can either avoid it in the future or take on the responsibility of doing something like that. And an interesting thing that has come about as a result of like social media allowing us these spaces to have conversations about how do you live your life and how do you live your life and how different people are able to navigate the world of it with different things like neurodivergences. There's all sorts of places where people can go and talk about their experiences with having disagreements with friends and navigating relationships in that way. When somebody is neurodiverse. And I know that one of the memes that's out there is being on the autism spectrum. It is often hard to understand whether or not seeking some of that context is considered rude to somebody else or not. And there's all sorts of really funny memes about things like that.
Yeah,
that one can find.
I also think that the Marcus Aurelius quote really focuses on truth and like finding truth. And I do think that today we do have a little bit more emphasis on like perspectives, and like people can have different perspectives. Whereas like an ancient Greek debate was, Ben and I spent an hour trying to find out who is having the correct interpretation of the murdering of the suitors. That would be really
like a strict adherence to logical rules and principles.
Yeah, whereas today there's some kind of acceptance there.
Yeah, and I think that's the point I'm making a bit is a neurodivergent mind is more likely to maybe resonate with a quote like this, and you might get snaps in the audience for the concept of like sometimes I don't really care about, I'm not asking you why all these things happened because I'm blaming anybody or anything like that. The only way to know the truth as as plainly as it is to have all of the information. Yeah, and that can sometimes be frustrating.
It can.
Yeah. Thank you for that quote. I think that was a really fun thing for us to explore. Thanks for talking about Epic with me. What are we talking about next week, Max? You got something to reveal?
I do have something to reveal. Next week we're going to be talking about Dragon Ball Z, and I'm just going to show y'all my really cool water bottle on this. I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, it's Goku.
Oh yeah, they can.
Yeah. So I got this on Amazon several weeks ago after a water bottle I had was stolen at the gym. So yeah, we'll be looking at the journeys of Goku and his friends next time on Max and Ben Save the World.
Next time on Max and Ben Save the World.